Hi, I'm Laura Nelkin. I'm a knitwear designer. I live in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region, and I love knitting with beads. There are a few different ways that you can incorporate beads into your knitting. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to place a bead onto a stitch in your knitting with 5 different tools. So let me jump right in and show you those 5 tools. Okay, the first tool that I like to use, and I use it the most often, is an 0.8 millimeter to 1 millimeter crochet hook. This is a small version of the crochet hook that I sell in my travel beading tins. You might also find that you have a crochet hook in your crochet hook and knitting needle stash that your grandma used to use for crocheting small things or tatting. Another thing that you can use to place a bead is a sewing needle, a fine sewing needle with a piece of sewing thread attached to it. Another thing that you can use is a fine gauge bendable piece of wire. You might have some wire lying around in your house. Another tool that I love to use is a piece of super floss. You can find this in your drug or grocery store in the dental floss aisle. And then finally, another tool that you can use is a beadle needle, and I sell these in my shop as well. So I'm going to jump right in and show you how to use the crochet hook, since that's the one I use the most often, and then I'll show you how to use those 4 other tools. Okay, I've got some size 6 Japanese seed beads here. And these size 6 Japanese seed beads have a hole that helps them fit perfectly on fingering or sport weight yarn. What I have on my needles right here is a fingering weight yarn. And what I've done is gone and grabbed a bead and put it onto my crochet hook. And now I'm going to go into the stitch that I want to have a bead on, slide it off the needle and pull up a little bit tightly so there's some tension on that stitch, and then take that bead, slide it down onto the stitch, and then put that stitch back onto your needle. Your pattern will then tell you if you're going to be slipping that stitch onto the right hand needle or knitting that stitch. You can play around if you're adding beads to a pattern and decide which technique works well for the stitch pattern that you're using. So that's how to use the crochet hook. Next up, let me show you how to use a wire. Okay, I have a piece of thin bendable wire that is a few inches long. I found this in my craft room. I'm going to go into the stitch that I want to have a bead on, put the wire into that stitch, and then take a bead, put it onto the wire, and then take the other end of the wire and feed it through that bead. And then basically you can see that the stitch is sandwiched now in that piece of wire. And I can take the bead, slide it down the wire and onto the stitch, and then slide the wire out. And now I have that bead on my stitch as well. So wire works almost like the crochet hook. It's just a little bit more fiddly. Okay, next up, I have a sewing needle with a small eye on it and a piece of thread attached to that sewing needle. You want to make sure that the sewing needle eye is small enough that it can fit through the hole of the bead. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a bead and just thread it down so that it is on the sewing thread. And then I'm going to go through the stitch that wants to have the bead, and then I am going to fold the sewing thread in half so that the needle can go through the hole on the bead again. And then I'm just going to be able to take that bead and slide it down onto the stitch, and then put that stitch back on the needle and pull the sewing thread out. So you can see that that's very easy as long as your eye is small enough, but it also is a little bit fiddly and easier to do if you're at a table than like on the couch. Next up, you can use a piece of super floss. And what's great about super floss is you can load your super floss with a bunch of beads on it and then have that with you so you don't have to have a beading bowl with you as well. So super floss, I have a piece kind of already out and ready to go here. It's got like a stiff tip on one end and then just a piece of dental floss attached to it. And when you purchase it, you'll find that there's a little end of dental floss sticking out from the stiff tip. And I find that it's really helpful to cut that off with a sharp scissor so that you just have the tip right there. And then you can load this up with as many beads as you want. I'll just get a few on there right now. And I'm going to take those beads and just slide them down my yarn, down my floss, sorry, a little bit so they're out of the way. And now I'm going to go into the stitch that I want to have a bead on. And then I'm going to fold that floss in half and go back through the hole of the first bead again. And you can see that that stitch is kind of sandwiched by the super floss, just like it was with the wire and with the sewing thread. And then I'm going to slide that stitch off and slide that bead onto the needle and then put that stitch back onto my needle again. And I believe I just said slide that bead onto the needle and I meant slide that bead onto the stitch. So there you have it. Super floss is very easy to use. Finally, the last tool I'm going to show you how to use is a beadle needle. And there is a trick to using a beadle needle. Beadle needles can be very useful if your beads are smaller, like if you're working with a size 8 Japanese seed bead or a seed bead that has a small hole. You can also use the super floss for that as well. These are a long needle that has a crochet hook in the very tip of the piece of wire. And what you'll do is put some beads on there. You can preload a lot if you want. And then you'll go into the stitch that you want to have a bead, grab it in that little hook right there, pull up tightly. You can see I'm kind of pinching underneath my work. And then I'm sliding that bead down onto the stitch. And then I'm putting the stitch back on the needle, but I can't really just drop the stitch because the beadle needle will get all caught up in the yarn. What I'm going to do is kind of push it a little further and turn it down so the hook is out of the way, and then I can easily pull it right out of the stitch without it getting caught in the stitch. So those are 5 different tools for placing a stitch on your knitting. I bet you're going to have a bunch of questions about this technique. If you look down at my knitting with me for a second, you can see that this bead is sitting vertically on a stitch. It's got both legs of the stitch going through the hole of the bead. So when you work a project where you're placing a bead on a stitch, it's going to be sitting straight up and down and not have any like movement or kinetic energy to it. If you pre-string beads onto your yarn and incorporate them into your knitting, that'll give you that kind of sense of energy and flow with your beads. I do have a lot of patterns where I use this technique of placing a bead on a stitch. I have kits in my Etsy shop that are smaller projects for you to learn how to do this with. I have patterns in my Ravelry shop. I'll give you links to things below if you want to explore this further. Please do ask questions if you have any. This is a remake of a video that I made one in 2011, I believe, and then one in 2016. So this is just kind of a fresh version of the same content. This is a technique I've been doing for a long time, and I hope you enjoy it. Please feel free to follow my channel, ask any questions, sign up for my newsletter so you hear when new patterns are coming out. I love knitting with you all and sharing the things that I'm learning. Happy knitting!